Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
In 1979, the U.S. Marines suffered one of the biggest natural disasters on an American base ever, injuring dozens and killing 13 service members at Camp Fuji in Japan. However, with all of the other world events happening at the time, it got pushed to the side in the news and in history. There's not even a Wikipedia article about it. Looking to change that is former Marine and retired WTOP journalist Chaz Henry. He has written a new book to tell this story, and he spoke to Federal News Network's Eric White about the book and his journey to make sure those that were lost are gone but not forgotten.
Why don't you just kind of start out by telling me about this incident that, as somebody who considers himself a sort of pseudo-military history buff, never heard of it here, and perhaps there's reasons why that we can discuss later, but just what exactly happened?
Sure. So October 1979, there's a super typhoon called Tip. It holds the record, still standing, as the largest, most intense typhoon ever. Now, a typhoon is the same thing as a hurricane, same thing as tropical cyclone, just different words to describe the same phenomenon. So people here are familiar with hurricanes. This thing, if you had taken it full size and set it over the continental United States, it would have covered between half and 2/3 of the country. It was massive. It was over the Pacific. So it ranged across the Pacific, made its way over Honshu, the main island of Japan, and below Mount Fuji, there was a ramshackle little Marine Corps camp. This is 1979. That was hosting about 1,200 some Marines who had come up from Okinawa to train on these wide open training fields where you could move infantry Marines, have tanks and artillery and mortars firing over them. So the storm's coming. They get word, well, you've got to hunker down. We've got to ride out this storm. They're living in Quonset huts, these old World War II era. Somebody described it as a half a tin can looking thing, a semicircular corrugated metal and wood frame building. The storm dumps in one day more rain than they typically get in the month of October in that area. And there was fuel stored above the camp. This is all on slightly sloping land, the very lower slopes of Mount Fuji. So uphill from where all the Quonset huts are these rubberized fabric fuel bladders. And these things were incredible. When they're empty, you fold them up. They're like a rug, easy to transport. When you fill them up, they can hold a lot of fuel, up to 20,000 gallons, actually. There was one fuel bladder that was filled with gasoline, another that was filled with diesel. A third one was filled with jet fuel, but it was further up the hill. The first two were attached by hoses to pumps, and there was a long berm, a 450-yard soil berm, and this is all volcanic soil beneath the hurricane, and that had been built up above the camp. The fuel bladders were put above that. The thought was, if we ever have a leak in the bladders, this berm will contain it and we'll be able to gather up the fuel. All this water accumulates behind the bladder. It creates a breach. So there's a 15 to 20 foot breach in this bladder. The rain lifts up the gasoline bladder and pulls it down into the breach. The hoses are still attached to the pumps. These pumps, with their frames and everything, weigh 1.5 tons each. The pumps are pulled down into this breach also. They have sharp edges. One of the sharp edges rips a 5-foot slice in the gasoline bladder, and 5,500 gallons of gasoline flows down this gently sloping hill into the Quonset huts where the Marines are living. And the Quonset huts are heated by open flame kerosene heaters. Imagine a couple of 55-gallon drums, one at each end of the hut. These huts each had 18 to 20 Marines in them. Vapors rose from the gasoline, which was floating on top of the water that had flooded into the huts, and it created whoomph. You can imagine, we've all had the experience on a backyard barbecue grill when too much lighter fluid's put on, and you get the whoomph. This is on a large scale and inside this contained corrugated metal space. Well, the Marines were in there riding out the storm. Some people had gone and they had, because the storm was just battering these Quonset huts, some people had taken plywood and nailed it on the outside doors of some of the huts. People had pushed wall lockers up against doors to keep the wind from blowing the door open and blowing in debris and rain. So as one hut exploded, the fuel was thrown into the air. Because there's gasoline on top of the water and the wind is blowing, the air is full of all these beads of gasoline. So there's fire in the air, fire inside the hut. The fire in the air settles down to the earth, which is covered by gasoline on top of rainwater. And so this rivers of fire are created in the camp. And there are walls of flame, curtains of flame, 10, 15 feet high, moving as this burning gasoline is on top of the water that's moving downhill. Well, of course, that moved the fire to other huts that caught fire. And inside the first few huts, people were terribly, first of all, oxygen was taken out as the explosion happened. And then, even if people weren't immediately burned, they said, we've got to get out of the hut. A lot of Marines ran out of the hut, and they ran right through these curtains of flame and were burned terribly. In the end, 73 people were injured in the incident, 54 of whom were burned, and 13 died.
Wow. So just about anything that could go wrong did go wrong. And, hindsight is 2020. Were there any after action reports that I imagine you definitely considered when, was there anything that they could have done to prevent it? I mean, obviously a huge typhoon coming through a makeshift training base isn't something that you obviously can prepare for that easily. What did you learn from the Marines' investigation afterwards?
Well, there was an investigation. It was called an informal investigation. That was a legal term to mean that there wasn't going to be a panel of investigating officers and people testifying under oath. Rather, a couple of investigators were assigned to go up, see what they could find, offer their observations to the commanding general who was in charge of the camp, and he would do with that what he decided was appropriate. First of all, there was a Japanese investigation the day after the fire. These camps were jointly shared, even though it was U.S. territory. It was ostensibly owned by the Japanese, and the Japanese, based on the end of World War II treaties, was obligated to put a lot of money into maintaining these camps for the American military forces. So Japanese investigators came the next day. I was able to get a copy of their report, which was really quite well done. There were a lot of measurements. There were a lot of photos. It wasn't until 4 or 5 days later that the Marines assigned investigators, and they came up, and I have to say, the report was thorough in its looking for what happened and what happened in what order. But its finding was, in the end, that it was only God. You could only blame God. There was no human responsibility. And in retrospect, even the commandant of the Marine Corps in 1991, the commandant who was in charge of the Marine Corps in 1979 when this happened, in 1991, when he was recording an oral history, he noted there were too many man-made factors. Now, certainly, almost certainly, if the storm had not come through, a storm of this scale, there would not have been a problem. So, the storm is the precipitating incident, precipitating cause. But those fuel bladders, interestingly, I looked at fuel handling regulations for the different military services at the time, and the Army regulations going back 7, 8, 10 years said specifically, don't put fuel uphill from where troops are stored. The Marine Corps manual was quite thin by comparison, and it focused more on what you do with these in combat, how you would apply them in combat, and not so much on safety in a training area. And the way that everything was set up did conform with the Marine Corps regulation. So it met that Marine Corps regulation, which you could argue perhaps wasn't as robust as it should have been. I've talked with a lot of people about, and universally, the guys who were there, almost universally, they say, it wasn't smart to put that up there. There were some reasons, if you're, not thinking like an engineer, there were some reasons that made it appropriate. Uphill, there was a roadside, and this was, there was a roadside, there was the berm, and then the fuel bladders were placed uphill of that. Pumps were put on top of the berm. And as vehicles were going out to the training areas, which all passed, they would all go on this road. It was easy to fill up the vehicles, get them out to the training area. Uphill of the berm, they would fuel tanks and amphibious tractors. Downhill on the road, there were no paved roads, but it was a dirt road where all the wheeled vehicles would go, the Jeeps and such. They could fuel them there. So as a matter of efficiency, and you could argue even safety, because when vehicles filled up there, they didn't have to drive down the camp. These are all, as I say, it's all soil. So, you're raising up dust. You're ripping up these dirt roads with these vehicles if they're constantly traveling there, particularly the tanks. And so all that to say that there were some arguments to be made as a daily efficiency for putting them there. But after the fact, I think it's universally realized that it was not a smart move. And regulations were changed in a narrow way afterwards. There was a change made to the Marine Corps fuel handling regulation that addressed sort of this specific circumstance, where there's a sloping terrain and where there is a chance of bad weather and erosion. Don't do this. But it didn't go so far as to say, never do this, the way, for instance, the Army manuals had.
What about from the disaster response wing of things when it comes to military bases? We see, still today that military bases have some deficiencies when it comes to dealing with disasters, whether it be hurricanes here in the continental U.S. or the famous fuel issues that are going on at Red Hill in Hawaii right now. Was there anything that changed, at least, within the culture or from a regulatory standpoint when it comes to natural disasters happening, were there certain precautions that are taken now? Anything of that matter?
Well, a lot of things are better than they were in 1979.
I would hope so. I would hope so.
Yes, and some of them improved within the next 3-4 years as budgeting was made for these improvements. But let me first go to your point about the response. And, these days in the military circles, everyone is familiar with the joint force, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force working together. And the culture has been changed to make that the norm. This was not the case in 1979. There was an ad hoc response that was quite impressive, particularly given that there wasn't this culture of constantly training together for these sorts of things. The services did a lot of things separately back then. But in this case, altruism and a concern for helping people who were genuinely hurt overcame that. And so there were some bumps and tussles as it was put together. But so the Marines at the camp had no firefighting capability of any consequence. They had 55-gallon drums filled with water, and they had a triangle that people were supposed to ring, if there was a fire, to warn people. Well, this is a loud typhoon going on. People can't hear. Japanese firefighters responded from a Japanese military camp across the road and from a nearby town, the town of Gotemba, Japan. There was no formal agreement. They called it a handshake agreement that if a disaster occurred, these people would respond. The firefighters had never been allowed on the camp, so they had no idea where buildings were, where water sources were, where hazardous material might have been stored. So they're coming in blind. So, this is just one of the things that sort of speaks to the nature of Japan-U.S. relations in 1979. So the firefighters did come up. They weren't told it was a fuel fire. So they brought water vehicles with them, which made it more dangerous for a period of time because the water just pushes the gasoline around. But eventually they did put out the fire. They brought it under control. Typically their practice was to control the fire, do an investigation to try to find the source, and then do a damage estimate. Well, after they put out the fire, they were immediately kicked off the base because, this is U.S. property. Okay, get off. And so there was some resentment on the part of the firefighters. This appeared in a local newspaper in that area saying, they never let us on the base. And yet when they're in trouble, they, say, come up here and save us. And then they kick us off. Subsequently, so the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time had been in office about 3 months. Before he left office, and it was a 4-year assignment, there was a brand new fire station on the camp, staffed by Japanese hired firefighters. And they could actually then have a handshake agreement with the town and have some resources to offer reciprocally if there was an issue. But that's one instance of something that was done in budget cycle terms fairly quickly. There were other changes in the next year or two beyond that, in which new barracks were built. They were of the sort that had been on Okinawa for a long time, much more resistant to typhoons, which are just a part of life there. And eventually fuel storage was put underground. So those are some things that, very evidently to the eye were improvements that were made in the wake of this. And then the medical response was similarly ad hoc, but very, very heartfelt. And of course, remember, this is in the middle of a typhoon. So there were no aircraft at the camp when this happened. Typically, you would immediately want to get helicopters in the air and start evacuating these guys to, a hospital of some sort. And there were a number of U.S. military hospitals in the area, perhaps half an hour flight away from this rather remote camp. They couldn't do that. Nobody was flying. In fact, most of the military pilots in Japan were at the club drinking because it was a typhoon party. There's no way you're going to fly in a typhoon. So, and there's a period of time, they call it 8 hours from bottle to throttle. You have to not have had anything to drink for 8 hours before you fly. So calls went out, who can we get, to come here and help evacuate? There was a naval air facility at Atsugi, Japan, and a lot of the pilots are at the club drinking. But there were two Navy helicopters that were off of a supply ship. The supply ship was in port at Yokosuka being loaded with supplies. And when that happened, these guys flew up to Atsugi, which had maintenance facilities. And so they're working on them. Their helicopters torn apart. Their maintenance guys are doing work on them. Those guys were alerted, and it took them a couple of hours to get one of the helicopters put back together. But they were ready to take off, and they actually landed. This was perhaps 4 hours after the fire started. And they flew in winds that they weren't supposed to. These were winds beyond regulation. And they had with them in the helicopter, these Navy pilots didn't know where Camp Fuji was. There were a couple of Marine pilots at Atsugi whose aircraft was torn apart. They had lost an engine, and so it was being reassembled. One of those guys rode with the Navy pilots to show them how to get down to the camp, because there are no aids to navigation, a lot of power outages, and so you had to be very careful flying. There were no lights over the planes they flew over, and such as planes PLAINS, the flatland they flew over, and there were towers and such to watch out for. There was a very dicey flight. There was also an Army doctor on that flight who had actually made his way from an Army base to Atsugi, and they put him on the plane. So it was this very ad hoc sort of thing. That was about 5 o'clock in the evening they arrived. In this time, what are you going to do with these Marines who were just horribly burned at this camp? You have nowhere to take them. They took them out into this rural Japanese town, and they dropped 10 of them. There are 40 plus really badly burned casualties. They dropped 10 of them at a Japanese military hospital where they received very good care. These were doctors who were better trained in dealing with trauma, and they were better equipped. The others were just taken to clinics and doctors' offices. And again, this is a rural area, so I'm not talking about big medical centers. And there was no agreement. No one had talked in advance, and there were very little English-Japanese interaction language-wise. And they just dropped these Marines at these clinics where doctors and nurses did the best they could with the equipment that they had. But in many cases, the guys didn't get IVs because it's very difficult. It's a very specialized skill to try to figure out how to put an IV through burned skin. But these Japanese doctors and nurses did what they could. And then an Air Force medical team from Yokota Air Base got into ambulance buses, and they made their way down. It took 3, 4, or 5 hours to get from their camp to where these people were being taken care of out in this Japanese town. Eventually, they gathered them up. They brought them back to the camp. And around midnight, the storm had passed sufficiently that they were able to get more helicopters in. Some Army helicopters came down from Camp Zama, Japan. And an overnight medical evacuation took place. So it was ad hoc, but I call it, altruism winning the day, and an example of the joint force long before it existed in the way that we know it today.
Yeah, I'll finish up with my last question here in a second, but ad hoc seems an understatement when you're talking about a triangle chess. They were using a triangle for an alarm. Was that a common practice back then?
It gives you a sense of how poorly resourced this camp was. It was, ramshackle might even be too nice a term. It was not well maintained even for that time. And we're talking about, post-Vietnam resourcing, but money had been spent in other places and not in this camp.
Gotcha. All right. And yeah, just in continuing the aftermath discussion, this is not an event that is, there's no ceremonies or famous ones, at least I know of, that are held for in memoriam. There, very little talk about this. Your book was the first time I had ever heard about it. Not saying I'm the end all know all about military history, but within the military community itself, you're a former Marine. Is this a well-known event between soldiers? And is there any talk of it among those who are the survivors of it? Is it getting the recognition it should at least get from the brethren in uniform?
So very few people know about this, even people in uniform and even people who were serving at the time it happened. I had an email the other day from a guy. He wasn't involved with the book, but he told me, so little is said about this in Marine Corps history that those of us who were there feel ashamed sort of asking themselves, did we do something wrong? Is there some reason this isn't mentioned? The principal reason that you and so many others don't know about it is because just 2 weeks after the fire, U.S. hostages were taken in Iran. And so large-scale attention just shifted. But then beyond that, there was an inclination within the Marine Corps leadership to let's not talk about this publicly, because it might beg the question of how did it happen? Questions might be raised. Could something have been done differently? Let's see what we can do to improve the camp and move on, is my sense of what they were thinking. There is a ceremony held every year at Camp Fuji, a memorial ceremony at which they read the names of the Marines who died. They have a roll call, and when the people don't answer the roll call, they ring a bell. And it's really quite poignant. I don't know how long this has been done. At least 10, 15, 20 years they've been doing this. I couldn't find evidence of it being done immediately after the fire occurred. There was a period of 4 or 5 years that, to my sense, they just didn't want to talk about it, because Marines on Okinawa who would go up there to train, I saw articles in the newspaper about how safe it was now at Camp Fuji, which leads me to believe that even at that time, for a period of 4 or 5 years thereafter, people were worried about it. Is the same thing going to happen? But with regard to how well known this is, I started in the project because I posted a photo of myself at Camp Fuji. I was there about a year and a half before the fire occurred. And I posted a photo and said, this was taken about a year before the big fire there. And I was shocked at the number of people, Marines included, who asked what fire. So in some Marine Corps newspapers, right after the fact, some base newspapers mentioned it. Some big base newspapers made no mention. Leatherneck magazine, the magazine of the Marines, made no mention of the fire, or even of some of these incredible stories of survivorship of guys who recovered from these terrible injuries and went on to do remarkable things. So that's what motivated me to work on this. These are guys all about my age. They're Marines of my generation. It was an event that really should have been documented. It's significant in any number of ways, many good, some not so good, but it is a legitimate part of our history. So I'm proud, particularly on behalf of these guys who are my fellow Marines about my age, to have been able to spend time, my time in the Marine Corps, my time as a reporter. I was able to do the research. I had just retired. The pandemic, all these things sort of came together, which in retrospect makes me think it was meant to be, because I was ready to work on the project and had the time. I'm proud, and particularly now that I'm hearing from guys who were there, who read the book and say it's a difficult topic. It was not without tears as I read it, but thank you for showing, hey, this really did happen.
The book is Fuji Fire. Retired journalist Chaz Henry is the author. Thank you so much for telling us the story and helping us spread the word about it ourselves.
I appreciate you doing that, Eric. This is what these Marines are doing, so I'm so grateful for the help. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Fuji Fire is available wherever you get your books now. Go ahead and check it out. Thanks again, Chaz.
Thanks, Eric.
That's just a taste of the conversation between retired journalist Chaz Henry and Federal News Network's Eric White. You can find their entire interview along with a link to Mr. Henry's new book on our website at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.